The year was 1857, and night had settled heavy over the lowlands of Charleston, South Carolina, pressing its humid breath against the wooden quarters where the enslaved tried to steal a few hours of rest. In the dim glow of a tallow candle, Isaac, a young black man whose strength had been forged by labor and loss, sat alone with the weight of another day on his shoulders. The plantation around him slept uneasily, the kind of silence that hid footsteps, whispers, and dangers that moved. After dark, the air smelled of damp earth and old pine, and beyond the window the moon hung like a pale, watchful eye over a land built on stolen breath. For Isaac, nights were never simply nights. They were shadows waiting to be read, signals waiting to be sensed. He had learned early that danger did not always roar. Sometimes it knocked softly, sometimes it wore perfume, sometimes it smiled with the gentleness of a lie. The plantation mistress, Eleanor Whitmore, had been studying him for weeks now, her gaze lingering with an unease he could not name. In the daylight, she carried herself with the fragile grace of a woman trapped in her own gilded world. But at night, her steps echoed with a different hunger, something sharp, unspoken, forbidden by law, yet tolerated by silence. Isaac felt it each time she passed near him, the way the air seemed to tighten, the way her eyes held him too long. On this night, the wind moved through the cypress trees with an uneasy sigh, carrying the distant sound of the main house door opening. Isaac stiffened. He knew that sound, knew the rhythm of her footsteps across the porch, knew the soft sweep of her gown against the boards as she crossed the yard. She was coming, not as a mistress checking on her workers, but as a woman crossing boundaries drawn in blood. His heart thudded slow and heavy, not with guilt, but with dread, with the knowledge that a refusal could cost him breath and a compliance could cost him soul. In the quiet of that narrow room, Isaac felt the world tilt, the night holding its breath as the danger he feared drew nearer with every step. The door to Isaac's quarter creaked as the night wind swept through the thin cracks in the walls, carrying with it the faint scent of magnolia and something sharper, the perfume Eleanor Whitmore favored, a fragrance too delicate for the weight it carried. Isaac sat still on the edge of his cot, every sense sharpened, his breath easing, shallowly as he listened to the slow, purposeful steps approaching across the packed dirt. The lantern she carried flickered through the doorway like a restless spirit, its amber glow stretching long shadows across the floorboards. Her silhouette appeared first, slender, tense, wrapped in silk that whispered as she moved. But it was the tremor beneath her composure that chilled him the most. Tonight, she was not a mistress supervising her estate. She was a storm that had crossed its boundary, seeking a place to break. Eleanor paused in the threshold, her fingers tightening around the lantern handle, the trembling light exposing the war between desire and impropriety burning behind her pale eyes. Isaac rose instinctively, not from obedience, but from a lifetime of surviving the unpredictable tides of those who claimed ownership over his body. The room felt smaller with her inside it, the walls pressing inward, trapping the heat of her breath and the cold foreboding. In his chest, she spoke his name softly, too softly, her voice carrying both command and vulnerability, a tone that crossed lines she had no right to step over. Isaac's pulse quickened, not with fear alone, but with the weight of a moment where every choice felt like a noose tightening. Outside, the wind rustled through the leaves, as if urging him to remain still, to listen, to measure every word that followed. When she stepped closer, the lantern light caught the sheen of tears, gathering at the edge of her lashes, hinting at struggles Isaac could neither name nor decipher. She whispered of loneliness, of a husband gone for weeks at a time, of a heart worn thin by expectations and silence, confessions she had no business laying at the feet of the enslaved. Isaac felt the floor shift beneath him, the world narrowing to the heavy breath between them. He knew that the danger was not in her words, but in the space they occupied, a space where refusal could be, twisted into defiance and acceptance, into betrayal of himself. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides as he summoned the strength to stand rooted in dignity. The lantern flame wavered as if sensing the tension, casting long, trembling lines of light across Isaac's face, revealing the quiet storm gathering behind his steady gaze. The lantern trembled in Eleanor's hand as she stepped deeper into the small room, its glow brushing the worn wooden walls and revealing the quiet order with which Isaac lived: a folded shirt, a patched blanket, a Bible whose corners had softened from years of handling. Her gaze lingered on these simple things with a strange kind of envy, as though the steadiness in his life, however burdened, contrasted sharply with the chaos she carried in her own. Isaac watched her carefully, noting the twitch of her fingers, the tightness in her breath, the way her eyes darted between him and the ground, as though fighting an invisible battle. The night felt suddenly too still, as if the very air feared to move, knowing the fragile border between wrong and ruin had already begun to dissolve. Eleanor reached out, her hand hovering inches from Isaac's arm, trembling not with cold, but with a desperation she could no longer mask. The gesture froze him where he stood. No chains had ever felt tighter than the unspoken demand in that outstretched hand. He stepped back with slow, deliberate restraint, each motion measured like a man navigating a cliff edge in darkness. A storm passed through her eyes, shame, longing, anger at herself, emotions she had never been taught to name honestly, only to bury beneath privilege. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, as if recoiling from the shift in the room. Isaac's voice, low and steady, broke the silence at last. "Mistress," he said, the word tasting of caution and sorrow, "this path can harm us both." His tone carried no accusation, only a truth she refused to hear. Her composure cracked then, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered how she felt unseen, unvalued, abandoned by the life she was bound to. The words spilled out like confessions meant for a church altar, not for the ears of a man forced beneath her roof and rule. Isaac felt his heart tighten, not with pity, but with the weight of being made a vessel for burdens he did not choose. He stood firm, drawing a breath deep enough to steady the tremor rising in his chest. "I am a man," he said softly, his voice carrying the dignity his world tried daily to strip away. "But I am not free, and you cannot ask me for what freedom gives." His words hung in the air, heavy, unyielding. Eleanor stepped back, startled, not by defiance, but by the revelation of her own wrongdoing. Outside, the night seemed to exhale, as though the world itself had been waiting for truth to cut through the tension. Eleanor's breath caught as Isaac's words settled over the room, their truth heavier than the humid night pressing against the walls. For a moment, she seemed suspended between two worlds, the one she was born into, gilded and suffocating, and the one she had trespassed into, shaped by chains she had never felt on her own wrists. Her gaze drifted toward the door, toward the vast darkness outside, as though searching for an escape from the shame unraveling inside her. Isaac remained still, his breath steady but guarded, the quiet strength of his posture revealing a man long accustomed to navigating the storms of others while offering no harbor for their destruction. The lantern cast wavering shadows across her face, revealing not malice, but a brokenness she struggled to contain. When she finally spoke, her voice was strained, as if torn from a place she had never allowed herself to confront. "I never meant to frighten you," she whispered, rubbing her hands together as though trying to warm fingers chilled by realization. Her confession trembled through the air, but Isaac knew better than to trust such moments. Repentance from the powerful was a fragile thing, easily shattered when convenience or pride returned. He answered with silence, not cold, but measured, allowing truth, not emotion, to fill the space between them. The ceiling beams groaned softly, the night insects hummed outside, and the whole world seemed poised on the edge of understanding something long denied. That a woman's loneliness could never justify a man's captivity. Eleanor lowered her head, the weight of her own misjudgment bending her posture more than any reprimand could. Isaac took a single step forward, not toward her, but toward his own dignity, reclaiming the air between them with a quiet, resolute calm. His voice, when it came, bore the gravity of lived experience. "What you ask," he said gently, "is a wound I would carry alone." The words struck her harder than any accusation, and she pressed a hand to her chest, as though steadying a heartbeat that faltered under truth. She turned toward the door, lantern trembling once more, realizing at last the line she had crossed. Not just in desire, but in forgetting the humanity of the man standing before her. As she stepped back into the night, the lantern's light stretched long and thin across the doorway before vanishing, leaving Isaac in the soft darkness of his quarters, his breath lifting in a slow exhale as the night reclaimed its silence. The night closed behind Eleanor like a heavy curtain, leaving Isaac alone with the fading echo of her footsteps and the dull ache of a moment that had nearly broken the fragile order of his world. He lowered himself onto the edge of his cot, elbows on his knees, letting the quiet seep into him like a balm and a warning. Though the room was small, it suddenly felt vast, the kind of emptiness that follows a storm that passed too close. He let his hands drift over the rough grain of the wooden frame, grounding himself in the familiar texture of something that asked nothing of him but endurance. Outside, the moonlight spilled through the cracks, soft and silvery, casting thin lines across the floor like threads, stitching him back into the night's uneasy calm. Yet even in the stillness, Isaac sensed that something in the air had shifted, a tension humming beneath the quiet like a hidden wire waiting to snap. He knew that a mistress leaving the quarters at such an hour could stir whispers among the patrols, the overseers, the night watch, men who were always too ready to assume guilt in the enslaved and innocence in the powerful. Rumors on a plantation were like sparks in dry grass. They spread fast, burned unjustly, devoured lives without a second thought. Isaac's chest tightened as he imagined the overseer's eyes narrowing at dawn, the questions sharpened like blades, the suspicions looking for a place to rest there. Wait. He had done nothing wrong, but innocence had never been a shield strong enough to stop a system built to punish him simply for existing. He rose to his feet again, pacing the narrow length of the room, every movement slow and deliberate. His mind retraced each moment of the encounter, not out of regret, but out of the instinct to survive, to catalogue his truth, to anchor himself to the clarity of what had transpired. The night wind pressed lightly against the shutters, carrying with it the distant creak of the main house settling and the far-off hoot of an owl perched in the old oak. Isaac paused, laying a hand against the wall, as though listening to the land itself. "Lord," he murmured under his breath, "keep falsehood from my door." It was a prayer shaped not by fear alone, but by the deep, steady resolve of a man determined to shield his dignity from whatever storm tomorrow might bring. Dawn crept slowly across the plantation, its pale light stretching over the fields like a thin veil unable to soften the unease settling into Isaac's bones. He stepped outside his quarter with measured breath, the earth cool beneath his bare feet, dew glistening on the grass like scattered tears. The sky carried that quiet, trembling blue that comes before full sunrise, a time when truths feel closest to the surface. Isaac kept his posture steady, shoulders squared, eyes forward, though he felt the weight of unseen eyes tracing every movement. The animals stirred in their pens, the horses stamping restlessly as though they sensed the residue of tension left behind from the night before, and beyond them the big house loomed in the half-light, still and silent, a place that held both power and danger in equal measure. As the morning bell rang, the first whispers began sliding through the yard like smoke drifting under doors. 2 field hands approached him hesitantly, their gazes flicking toward the main house before settling on him. They asked no direct questions. Such questions were too dangerous to speak aloud, but the concern in their eyes revealed everything they suspected. A white figure seen crossing the yard, a lantern moving where it should not, footsteps returning too quickly for innocence. Isaac felt their worry wrap around him like an old cloak, familiar yet heavy. He simply nodded, offering the kind of reassurance built not on promises of safety, but on the quiet dignity his people leaned on. When justice was too far away to grasp, "I did nothing to shame myself," he murmured, and they accepted that truth with the solemnity of a prayer. But not all eyes watched with concern. From the far end of the yard, the overseer stood with his arms folded, leaning against the fence post, as if waiting for something to reveal itself. His face was unreadable except for the tightness in his jaw, a sign Isaac recognized all too well. Suspicion, entitlement, the hunger for someone to blame. The overseer's gaze followed Isaac for a long, unbroken moment, cold and calculating, as though flipping through the pages of a story he intended to rewrite. Isaac felt the chill of that stare, a warning that the danger had not ended with Eleanor's retreat into the night. It had only changed shape, and now the daylight threatened to expose a narrative Isaac could neither control nor outrun. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself in faith and steadiness, preparing for a day where truth alone would not be enough to shield him. As the sun climbed higher, the rhythm of the workday settled over the fields, yet an unease clung to every breath Isaac drew. He moved through the rows with practiced precision, the cotton brushing against his hands like whispers from another life. But his thoughts were not on the work. They lingered on the fragile line he walked between innocence and accusation. Each time he straightened his back, he caught sight of the overseer's figure, perched on horseback at the edge of the field, watching him with a stillness too deliberate to be casual. The man's shadow stretched long across the earth, as though trying to touch Isaac's heels, reminding him that danger could travel without sound. Other workers glanced between the 2 men, sensing a tension simmering beneath the hush of the morning, the kind that often preceded injustice disguised as discipline. By midday, the air thickened with heat, carrying the metallic scent of anticipation, the kind Isaac had known since childhood, when storms gathered not in clouds, but in the moods of men who believed authority was the same as righteousness. The overseer dismounted and approached him with slow, measured steps, boots sinking into the soil with a deliberate heaviness. His voice came low, edged with false curiosity. "You were awake last night, weren't you?" he asked, phrasing it not as a question, but as a snare. Isaac kept his gaze steady, offering neither defensiveness nor submission, only truth crafted with caution. "I rested in my quarter," he replied evenly. The overseer's eyes narrowed, searching Isaac's face for cracks he would not find. In the silence that followed, the tension coiled tighter, a serpent circling for the right moment to strike. When the overseer finally stepped back, his lips twisted into the faintest smile, not of satisfaction, but of someone who had decided on a conclusion long before hearing any answer. He turned away, leaving Isaac with the unmistakable knowledge that a private verdict had been made, invisible yet already binding. The workers around him exchanged uneasy glances, their hands moving slower, their breaths catching in their throats. Isaac lowered himself back into the rows, the cotton swaying gently around him like a fragile barrier against the rising storm. A prayer formed silently on his tongue, not for safety, but for clarity, that the truth of his actions might stand, unshaken against the lies others might craft. The sun bore down, unrelenting, but Isaac's spirit did not bow. He carried the quiet, steady resolve of a man who refused to let another's suspicion steal his dignity. The afternoon stretched long and relentless, the heat pressing against Isaac's back like a warning he could not outrun. As the workers gathered near the well for a brief rest, the murmur of voices grew sharper, edged with fear and curiosity. A young boy, no more than 14, approached Isaac with hesitant steps, his eyes wide with worry. "They say Miss Eleanor's been crying all morning," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder as though the wind itself might carry his words to the wrong ears. "Say the master's due back tonight." The boy's voice trembled under the weight of unspoken consequences. Isaac felt the words land like a stone in his chest. The master's return meant questions, accusations, and a dangerous thirst for explanations that could twist truth into something unrecognizable. The very air seemed to shift, thickening around him as the fragile order of the plantation prepared to tilt. Across the yard, women hung linens on the lines, their hands shaking as they exchanged glances toward the big house. Rumors traveled quickly on plantations, faster than truth, faster than justice, faster than a man's ability to defend himself. Isaac stood still, absorbing the tremor of their fear, the subtle way their eyes lingered on him with both concern and quiet pleading. They knew all too well how stories born in the mouths of the powerful often ended in blood. Isaac drew a slow breath, straightening his shoulders. "I did no wrong," he said softly, as if reassuring the earth itself. But the women's faces revealed a harsher wisdom. When injustice hunted a man, innocence was only a fragile shield, cracked by the first blow of suspicion. As the linens fluttered in the breeze, they looked like ghosts, reminders of lives undone by secrets not their own. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a long, golden haze over the fields as Isaac returned to his work. Yet every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath a boot, tightened the knot in his stomach. He felt the weight of invisible eyes tracing his silhouette, waiting for any sign of guilt they could shape into a story. As shadows lengthened, he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, lifting his gaze toward the distant oak, where the master usually tied his horse upon returning. A flock of crows perched in its branches, their dark forms stark against the dimming sky, a silent omen. Isaac whispered a quiet prayer, steady and sincere. "Lord, let the truth stand taller than fear." The light thinned, the birds called out, and the evening settled around him like a slow-closing hand. As dusk settled over the plantation, the horizon darkened to a deep, restless blue, and the cicadas began their sharp, unbroken song. A sound that often drowned the world, yet tonight felt like a warning carried on wings. Isaac finished the day's labor with steady hands, though the muscles in his back tightened with every passing minute. He knew the master would return soon. The distant rumble of wheels on the dirt road was a sign as familiar as the turning of seasons. Workers moved quietly around him, avoiding his eyes, not out of judgment, but out of fear that being seen near him might pull them into the storm they sensed rising. Isaac gathered his tools and walked slowly toward the quarters, each step a deliberate act of composure in a world watching for cracks. Inside his small room, the shadows lay thick and unmoving, the last strands of daylight stretching through the wooden slats like thin fingers, searching for a truth they could not grasp. Isaac sat on the edge of his cot, clasping his hands as he listened to the plantation settle into its nightly rhythm. The hush of livestock, the muted clatter from the kitchen house, the soft thud of doors closing. Yet beneath it all, he felt the land holding its breath. Eleanor's footsteps had not crossed the yard since dawn, but he could sense her presence like a storm cloud stirring behind shuttered windows. He imagined her pacing, crying, rehearsing explanations in front of mirrors where her power looked different in the cold light of consequence. For her, tears might soften judgment. For him, tears could never be afforded. Then came the sound, distant at first, then unmistakable, the rhythmic clatter of hooves and wheels rolling down the main road toward the house. The master had returned. A lantern swung in the yard as a field hand hurried to assist, his face pale even in the dim glow. Isaac remained still, forcing his breath into slow, disciplined rhythm. He heard voices, muffled at first, then sharper, the master's tone edged with irritation from travel. The door of the main house opened. A pause, words exchanged too low to decipher, and then the sound Isaac dreaded most, a sudden rise in the master's voice, not loud enough to be a shout, but sharp enough to slice through the night like a blade. Isaac closed his eyes, knowing without seeing that a story was being told inside that house, a story that might place him in its center without his consent. The night thickened as Isaac stepped outside his quarter, drawn by the rising tension pulsing through the air like a distant drumbeat. Lanterns flared to life around the main house, their trembling light revealing hurried silhouettes moving behind curtains. The master's voice cut through the quiet again, sharper this time, strained with disbelief, anger, and something darker beneath. Isaac stood still in the yard, half cloaked in shadow, careful not to appear as though he were listening. Yet the windows leaked enough sound for his heart to piece together the shape of a conversation he had prayed would never take place. A woman's sobs, a man's breath rising hard, and between them a silence that felt like a verdict forming its first edge. Isaac's chest tightened, not from fear alone, but from the ache of knowing how easily the powerful rewrote truth when shame came knocking on their own doors. A door slammed, footsteps echoed across the porch, heavy, hard, carrying the weight of a man who believed anger was the same as authority. The master stepped into the yard, lantern in hand, the light casting his face in harsh strokes. His eyes swept across the property, searching, hunting, desperate for something or someone to hold accountable for the pain festering inside the house. Isaac remained motionless, his posture straight but not defiant, his breath held in the quiet dignity he carried like armor. The master's gaze flicked toward him, lingered a moment too long, then moved on. But the seed of suspicion had already been planted. Isaac felt it settle on him, like a chain being fastened link by link, quiet but unyielding. The workers nearby lowered their heads, unwilling to witness what might come next. At last, the master returned to the steps, leaning heavily against the railing as though wrestling with a truth he could neither confront nor swallow. The lantern light flickered across his features, revealing not certainty, but confusion, wounded pride, and the desperation of a man seeking order in a tangled world. Isaac watched from the shadows, his heart steadying with a slow, measured resolve. He knew the story of the night might shape itself into a weapon, not forged from what happened, but from what others feared to accept. He whispered a quiet plea into the darkness, not for escape, but for strength. Lord, guide me through the words they cast. The wind stirred slightly, rustling the grass at his feet, as if offering its own small comfort. And though the master eventually retreated back into the house, Isaac recognized that the true confrontation had only just begun. The hours crawled past midnight, yet sleep did not touch a single corner of the plantation. The workers lay restless in their quarters, listening to the wind shift and the floorboards creak beneath footsteps that carried anger from room to room within the big house. Isaac sat upright on his cot, elbows on his knees, the dim glow of a dying candle casting uneven shadows across his face. Though the air was still, he felt the night pressing against him, heavy with questions that he had not been asked yet, but soon would be. Outside, an owl called from the cypress tree, a long, low cry that seemed to echo the truth he already knew. Danger often arrived in the hours when the world pretended to sleep. Isaac lifted his gaze toward the small window, watching the moon part thin clouds as though trying to shine a path through a moment too dark to navigate alone. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps approached, their rhythm too sharp to belong to someone wandering. Isaac rose just as a familiar figure appeared at the threshold. Old Ruth, the eldest woman on the plantation, her back bent, but her spirit still steady as the roots of the land. She entered without a word, closing the door softly behind her. Her eyes, tired and wise, searched his face with a sorrow deeper than fear alone. "Child," she whispered, her voice thick with the weight of what she could not say aloud. "They speak in your name in that house." Her words settled into the room like the final toll of a warning bell. Isaac felt the truth strike him, but he did not flinch. Ruth stepped closer, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "Miss Eleanor, she ain't told a lie, but she ain't told the whole truth neither." It was the closest she could come to naming the dangerous void between confession and silence. Isaac lowered his head for a moment, drawing in a deep breath that steadied the storm, building inside him. "I touched no wrong," he said quietly, meeting Ruth's gaze with a calm forged from faith and the long, bitter knowledge of how stories traveled among the powerful. Ruth nodded, tears welling, not for his guilt, but for the injustice she knew was already threading itself through the walls of the main house. "I know, child. But the master, he's hurt, and hurt men look for blame with their eyes closed." She squeezed his arm gently, her hands trembling with age and fear. "Be ready. They'll come for questions before the sun stands high." The candle flickered as if trembling at her words. When she left, the door closed with a soft thud that felt like the sealing of a moment Isaac could not escape. He stood alone in the quiet, his silhouette framed by shadows, whispering a steady plea into the tense stillness. "Lord, let truth do its work before a lie takes breath." The sky had barely begun to pale when the first knock rattled Isaac's door. Not the hesitant tap of a neighbor, but the hard, deliberate pounding of men who believed answers came only under pressure. Isaac stood slowly, every movement calm, as though stilling the storm within him would steady the one gathering outside. When he opened the door, 2 white men from the master's household stood before him, the overseer, jaw tight with a satisfaction he did not bother to hide, and a house servant who avoided Isaac's eyes, guilt pulling his gaze toward the ground. Behind them, the early dawn light cast thin, cold lines across the yard, revealing the brittle tension that had settled like frost over the plantation. "Master wants words with you," the overseer said, his tone sharp as wire. It was not a request, it was a summons. Isaac stepped into the morning air, its chill brushing against his skin like a warning. As he walked toward the big house, he felt the eyes of his people following him, quiet and heavy with fear. Children peered from behind. Doorways, women paused mid-task, men lowered their tools, all bearing witness to the moment a man walked toward judgment built on rumors instead of truth. Each footstep echoed louder than the last, carrying him across the yard where the soil held memories of footsteps that never returned. The house loomed larger with each breath, its windows glowing faintly as though heated by anger still simmering inside. Isaac lifted his chin, not in defiance, but in dignity, the kind a man carries. when he refuses to let another reshape him into something small. Inside, the master stood near the fireplace, his face shadowed by the flickering light. He did not look at Isaac at first. He stared into the flames, as though the truth lay hidden somewhere within their shifting patterns. Eleanor sat rigidly in a chair, her hands clasped tight in her lap, her eyes swollen from crying. When she lifted her gaze to Isaac, shame flickered there, raw, real, and edged with fear for what her silence and half-truths might become. The master finally turned, his voice controlled but trembling beneath the surface. "My wife tells me you frightened her last night," he said, the words brittle as dry wood. The accusation hung in the air between them, built not on fact but on wounded pride. Isaac felt the room constrict around him, yet his voice, when it came, was steady. "Sir, I did her no harm. I held my place. I spoke no word unfit." The truth fell like a stone into a well, sinking, with no guarantee it would ever reach the bottom. The master's expression hardened, though a fracture of uncertainty flashed behind his eyes. A brief glimpse of a man torn between believing the story that protected his pride and confronting the truth that threatened it. Eleanor shifted in her chair, fingers twisting in her lap, as though each movement unraveled another thread of guilt. The room felt tight, the air thick with the unspoken consequences that could fall. On Isaac, with a single word. "So you claim innocence," the master said, pacing slowly, his boots striking the floor in sharp, uneven rhythms. "You expect me to believe you?" His voice trembled at the edge of fury, frayed by fear of humiliation more than concern for his wife. Isaac lifted his gaze, meeting the master's eyes with a calm that did not waver. "I speak only truth," he answered, each syllable grounded in a dignity no accusation could steal. Outside, the first light of morning, pressed against the windows, as though the day itself waited to hear which story would take root. Eleanor's breath hitched, a sound that cut across the room like a thread snapping under too much strain. She rose slowly from her chair, her face pale, her body trembling not from Isaac's presence, but from the weight of her own choices. "He did nothing," she said at last, her voice thin but piercing in the stillness. "I went to him. He did not seek me." The confession hung in the air with the fragile strength of something long withheld, and the master's face reddened with shock, not at Isaac's innocence, but at the revelation of what his household had nearly become. Shame washed through him, sharp and unrelenting. His jaw tightened as he turned away, unable to face either the truth or the cost of admitting how close he had come to condemning an innocent man. For a long moment, the room held its breath, the crackling fire the only witness to the unraveling of blame. When the master finally spoke, his voice was low and strained, hollow with the effort of swallowing pride. "Return to your work," he said, not out of kindness, but because there was no punishment he could deliver without revealing a deeper disgrace. Isaac bowed his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of a truth that had survived the night. He walked out of the house with steady steps, the early sun warming his face, as though reminding him that dignity, even threatened, could not be taken from a man who stood firmly in it. Workers watched from a distance, relief and quiet reverence softening their eyes. Isaac paused for a moment in the yard, breathing in the cool morning air, feeling the storm pass behind him like a shadow fading from the ground. What the night had tried to twist into ruin had become instead a testament, a quiet proof of a man's resolve to remain whole in a world determined to break him.